Hey guys, this is NATO. I saw a question over on the UT forums about master materials with the new environments in UT, and I thought I'd take some time to make a video explaining what they are and why Epic are using them and how you can use them yourself to make really cool environments. So first off, we have 5 meshes here, all from the Outpost set. We have a little floor panel, we've got a pillar, a wall, and 2 DK meshes. One slightly quite large with a glowy bit, and one slightly smaller with a glowy bit, and one pretty big. So something you might not realise is that all of these meshes are actually using the same material. They're not on the surface using the same material. If you actually click on them and look in the materials panel, you can see they're different materials and different folders, but actually, in actual fact, they're all using the same master material. Now, if you've never used master materials before, this might seem confusing. Normally, in the past, you'd have your meshes and they'd have one material each, and you might even have a specific texture set, a diffuse, a normal, and a specular or whatever, to describe the material on that surface. However, with master materials, you don't do that. You have one master material which you make kind of sub copies of, little split off sub copies that describe different materials, or describe the same material across different meshes. Now, there are 3 things you kind of need to know before master materials will really make sense to you. None of these are very complex or confusing on their own, and in general, they're pretty good things to know anyway. So, if you're pretty experienced with Unreal Engine, these might not seem that important or strange or unusual. But if you're new and they're confusing, I'm going to put some links down in the description to the UE wiki, which should help clear up anything that you're confused about after this. And always feel free to ask questions, either here or on the UTIRC or on the UT forums or anywhere you can find me. Feel free to ask questions. I'm always happy to answer questions. Okay, so number 1 on our list of things to explain about master materials are material instances. Now, material instances are really useful. They allow you to take a basic material and make small little tweaks to it so that you can use it again without having to remake that material entirely again, all over again. They're very, very useful. They've been around a while now. They're in UE3 and UE4. They've made a few little small tweaks to them for 4, which are kind of powerful and kind of useful. But in general, they are really useful, and if this seems really new to you, then I would definitely go read up on them because they are hugely useful. So first off, let's start by making a base material. Now, if you're making a material you intend to use with instancing, you do need to make a few little changes, do a few different things than you would normally. So first off, what you might normally do if you wanted to create a color, a basic color for your material, is have a vector or a texture or something like that. We're just going to go with a base color. And you might say, I want this to be, let's go with a kind of a dark, almost kind of yellowy. I'm intending to make like a gold material. That's not really goldy. Let's go with that. Gold's actually surprisingly red. So you might do that and go, okay, well then. So there's our color, and then I want to make this fully metallic, and then I want to have very low roughness. So let's go with 0.2 roughness. Yeah, there we go. And you might say, yeah, okay, that's my material. I'm pretty happy with that. Let's save this material. For reference, this material is just saved as tut1 because it's easy and simple. And I've already got it applied to this surface. I don't quite know how that happened, but let's reapply it just in case. So yeah, and you go, yeah, I'm pretty happy with that material. Looks kind of shiny and gold-like. It's a bit burnished to be gold, really, but whatever, that works. And then you might go, okay, well, I want silver. Do I really want to create a new material to make silver? Because it's got it's the same basic setup. But I want a color, and I want a metallic, and I want a roughness. but I don't really need anything else. And it kind of seems a shame to completely recreate this very simple texture just to change those numbers. Now, this is what material instances allow you to do. They allow you to basically give these nodes particular names that allow you to reference them later and change those values. You do this via things called parameters. In our case, to change for a color, so to a vector, which is what this is, we want a vector parameter. And we're going to go ahead and plug that straight into base color. I'm actually going to copy the base color and paste it in. That's a useful little feature if you've never seen it before. You can copy vectors and whatnot. Okay, so now we have a color parameter. Now we need to give this a name. Now, because I'm British, I'm going to put a U. I'm going to put a U in my spelling of color because I'm British. It doesn't really matter how you spell these things. It doesn't really matter. You can call it whatever you like, and it'll still work. It just needs to be a name that you recognize, a unique name that you recognize, unique to that texture. So if you had a second color parameter, these two nodes would output the same thing. You couldn't independently decide what these are. You'd have to have it called something like color2 to actually work separately. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is set up our metallic and our roughness to be parameters. Now these are scalar parameters because they scale between 0 and whatever, rather than vectors. So scalar parameter, and we want to call this one metallic. Oops. If I can actually type. I'm just going to copy this and rename this one to roughness. Roughness. I'm going to recreate this material very quickly just by doing this. Metallic of 1, roughness of 2. I go ahead and save that. And as you can see, our material is exactly the same as it was before. Nothing's actually changed on the surface, but this setup allows us to do one thing which is really cool. Now if we head over, bring in our content browser, and right click on our Tut1 material, you can see you have a little button here saying create material instance. I'll create an instance and call it tut1_inst because it's pretty generic. So we're going to make this instance here a kind of silver color. But first I'm going to copy our sphere. I'm going to apply our material instance, our new material instance to that object, so that when we make changes, we can see them actually happen. I'll go ahead and open this. I'm actually going to juggle my ignore that behind there. I'm going to juggle this a little bit so that we can see both. Okay, so this is our material instance, and this is the material instance editor. As you can see, it kind of looks a bit different. It looks a lot like a lot of the other editors, though. We have a big viewport and some crazy buttons. Okay, so we want to make a silver. So let's change this color. Let's go with a kind of a very light blue. Oops. And let's make this up the roughness and actually lower the metallic. Let's bring some more color back in as well. There we go. There we go. But as you can see, we've changed that material a fair bit. Obviously, it's still very similar basic setup. It's just a simple color, and then you're just modifying the two variables. But they are very different. One being a lot more shiny, and then the other one being a different color. Pretty useful. If we open back up the material instance, you can see you have this thing here called parent. Now, this is very important to material instances. This is basically the base material that is being modified. So if you ever want to work out what the parent material, what the base material of any material instance is, this is the place to go. As you can see, it shows you Tut1. If I click the show in browser and move this back over, You can see it points at our Tut1 material we made earlier. Oops. So yeah, that's the basics of material instances. Now these can get really complicated, but that's the basic principle. You can create a copy of a material and make a few little small changes, and you can get a pretty different effect without having to dramatically change the material. Okay, let's go and have a look at our outpost meshes and see if we can apply what we've learned just to understand them a bit better. So we have our 5 meshes here, and as I said originally, these are all using the same material, but they're actually using different instances of that material. So let's take a look at our floor hatch and open up our content browser, and we can see that it's using this this mesh here, this texture here, which is M Leandri floor hatch 01. Let's open that up. It opens up the material instance editor, which yeah, it's this one's pretty complex. It has a lot of variables. First off, let's go down and take a look at the parent of this master material, which is M Leandri master material in all caps. Isn't that big and scary? Not really, but yeah, it's when you see something big and all in caps, it's kind of intimidating. But I think that's really so it's easier to find in the content browser. But as you can see, this material instance has a lot of parameters. Now, the thing about master materials is they're pretty complex. They have lots of little moving pieces and parts, but really that's so that you can properly tailor each instance to the case in what you actually need it to do. And for something like this, as you can see in this floor hatch, almost none of these almost none of these parameters are actually active. You can tell if they're active by whether or not there's a tick on this left-hand side column here. The only two that are actually active are the main normal map and the paint/metal edge mask. Let's turn both of these off, and you can see it just changes the base material, base texture that's being used to render these things. And I'll go into exactly how that works in a bit, but you can see that even though there's all these different settings, none of them are actually being used right now for this material, this material instance. We're only using these two. That's kind of important to understand, which I'll go into detail when we look at this look at this particular method specifically. But for now, as you can see, it's not as scary as it looks. It's only these little two things that are being modified. Okay, so the next thing to take a look at are material functions. Now, these are new to you before, and they can be a little bit confusing if you've never seen them before. But they're very powerful and very useful, and they have a specific use in the master material system, which I will talk about in a second. But first, let's have a general overview of what they are. So material functions are basically little self-contained packets of material graph, like little material scripts that do something specific. Now, normally these will take in some variables, and they will perform the same action on them, and then spit out those variables with that action applied. An example of this would be something like a contrast, where you would give it a texture material, a texture reference, and then a scalar reference of how much you wanted to increase or decrease the contrast, and then it would spit out that same texture, but with that contrast change applied. Now, these can be very simple, or they can be massively complex. But let's take a look at some of the simple ones first. We're in our little Tut1 material here. We probably won't actually make any changes to this. I just wanted a simple material, just so you could rest your eyes on while I talked, so it wasn't scaring anybody. Okay, so let's head over to the palette and change over to functions, just so we have our big list of functions before we before we do anything. Okay, so you can see here there are lots and lots of different functions. There are even some specific UT ones. Functions are pretty easy to create. They're just basically like materials. They're just self-contained little scripts. So there are some specific UT ones here. There's some for outside. I'm pretty sure I saw some other ones further down. But yeah, there are a lot of material functions, and they do a lot of different things. So let's look for, as we said before, contrast, cheap contrast. Let's bring in a cheap contrast little function. As you can see, it is just a little node, and it has a couple of inputs. It has an in text, has an in, which takes in a scalar and a contrast, and then it spits out a result. So let's open this up. You can open up any material function by double clicking on it, and it'll open up the material function. Now, this looks a lot more complex than it is, but that's just the nature of these things. As you can see, it takes in an input contrast scalar. So this takes in a scalar input, and its input name is contrast. And it also takes in an input in scalar. So it takes in another scalar, which it's calling in, and it does stuff to it. In this case, it increases the contrast. This one's actually a little bit more complex than I was hoping for. So I'm actually going to close this. A really simple function to look at if you just want to just to understand what a function, how simple functions can be, is the pi function. Now the pi function, essentially, you stick in a scalar multiplier and it spits out pi multiplied by the multiplier value. So if you stick in 2, it'll give you pi times 2, which is essentially basically what this function does. It takes in a scalar, multiplies it by pi, as you can see. Oops, no, I don't want to change the value of pi. That would be very unfortunate. It takes in the value of pi and outputs the result. Yeah, it's very, very simple. All it does is it saves you a few clicks having to set this up if you need it for your material function, your material. Similarly, another one is the multiply add, which takes in a base and an add and spits out a result. And all this does is exactly as you would imagine. It takes in the add and the base, multiplies the base by the add, and then adds that base back into that multiply, and then outputs it. Now you might be thinking, well, this isn't very complex. I could just stick this. I could create this really simply in my material here. Why would I need to do this? Like, surely that's just wasted time. Well, if you use this function 4 or 5 times, then you've saved a lot of clicks doing that. And it also means that if you have a little bug or you want to make a slight change to how this works, you only need to go here and do this. Make changes to this. On top of this, functions can be very, very complex. Let's take a look at the 3-point levels function, which is very similar to how 3-point levels in Photoshop would work. It's about changing the values of black and white in the image. But this takes in quite a lot of variables and is pretty complex. And let's say you wanted to use this, even if you wanted to use this twice or possibly 3 times in different materials across your project, setting this up and having your technical artist set this up so that your environment artist or your character artist doesn't need to sit down, work out how all this works, is pretty useful. It saves time and it's very time. Yeah, it's just useful. I use this 3-point levels thing, this function, in a couple of places, and it's pretty useful just to throw in and not have to worry about making sure all this works as intended, because it does. Okay, so here we have the material layer Paint Master from the Liandry set, and it looks an awful lot more like a standard material you might have seen elsewhere. You've got a texture sample here, you've got a normal here, diffuse tint. It looks pretty. The shape of the graph is very familiar to the sort of UE3 era textures, materials even. The big differences are, instead of going to a material output, it's going to a single output result, and also instead of having parameters, which you then use in a material function, a material instance even, you have these input nodes. For example, this is the input diffuse tint, which is a vector 3, which takes in a vector 3 and then passes it to whatever it needs to do. You can also see that there's a preview node here. Now, preview nodes are exactly that. They're not defaults, they're previews. They will show you exactly how the material will look with those settings. The important thing to note is that, as I said, they're not defaults. So when you create this node in your material, in your master material or any other material, you have to pass something into inputs. So let's take a look at where this particular instance is used over in the Liandry master material. We have this paint, ML paint master, which is exactly what this material is called. This material function is called. As you can see, we're passing in various different variables which are going in to make the appearance of the paint surface. You also have down here a material layer paint metal master, which is very similar in concept. It's just a slightly different setup for a material. On top of that, we also have a grime setup, which again, same concept, these material layers. Now these are all layered on top of each other via the third thing that I need to talk about, which is the concept. This is more of a concept than a particular thing, which is the kind of material layering, which is usually done with a specific kind of material function, which is a material layer blend. By default, you'll just use the standard. Now, this is actually a complex setup of linear interpolations, or lerps, which basically just blend between two different materials via an alpha channel, via an alpha texture, just so like a scalar, like a black and white texture. Let's take a look at this material function. Now, this looks terrifying, but really it is just a series of lerps that take in each material, breaks it up, lerps it, brings it back together, and then outputs it. And this really harks back to what I was saying before about material functions. Just imagine having to set up this function, this setup, for every single time you wanted to use one of these material functions, these material layers. That would be horrendous and would take ages, and would also be really it would just make the graph horrendously messy. So that's the real power of material functions, is they make that kind of thing so much easier. Okay, so now that we know the kind of three basic things I was talking about before to understanding master materials, let's take a look at this in a greater detail, in a bigger scope. So we have these material functions, these material layer functions that define our paint. What do we want our paint to look like? It defines what we want our metal to look like, and our grime, and there's a grime 2 here, but that's only used in specific cases. In this, there's a little switch parameter here. So really we only have these three, and they're blended together with these material layer blend standards. And you may have seen this little texture sample here. Now, this texture that it's sampling is pretty strange. It kind of almost looks like a normal map, but not quite. And this is because it's a composite texture, really. You wouldn't use this as a diffuse or as a specific texture sample using all three channels. Now, this is something which a lot of people use just to cram more information into textures that they're putting into the game, but you might not have seen this before. Something you can do in UE4 is view textures by channel. So let's turn off everything and then turn on red. Now that's a nice black and white mask, and so is green. And then blue is like a standard, that looks like a ambient occlusion map to me. And then alpha is just blank white. There's nothing on the alpha channel in this texture. And the useful thing about this is you can use, as I said, these channels to mask out certain areas. Now, for the Liandry set, they actually use the standard red channel for sort of areas they want to be grimy. Then they use the green channel for areas they want to show metal through. And the blue channel is by default the ambient occlusion. And that allows us to basically, since we know this, we can set up our layers, set up our basically lerps to lerp through, to put the paint on top, and then where the paint is worn away, or where we want the paint to show through, we have this green channel coming through into the alpha to show the metal, and then again the grime with the red. And then down here we have that's an alternate texture. And then here we have the AO from the same material function, same material reference, and it's grabbing the AO. Yeah, so use AO if only gram2 isn't used. That's just a little function that it means that they can cram an extra grime mask if they need to onto the blue channel optionally, which by default isn't used. Okay, so yeah, that's essentially how material functions work, how master materials work even. So I want to take a look at a couple of the material instances that we looked at. Let's not save any of these for these meshes that we looked at earlier. So the first off, let's have a look at the floor hatch. Come on, load. Why aren't you loading? And as I mentioned before, we can scroll down and look at the texture parameter values that we looked at earlier. And as you can see, as I said before, there's only two ticked. The paint edgeware mask, or this mask, and the normal map, which, when we look back at the master material, makes a lot of sense. Because the only things we actually want to change on this material, while it takes a long time to compile, are the textures we're using to define exactly where the metal is showing through and where the grime is. We also want to change the normal map, which is where is the normal map on this one? Yeah, the normal map here. So those are set up to be parameters, along with all of these other things. But the only ones we're actually changing in this case are those two, which is really useful. So let's take a look at one of the other ones that's slightly more complicated. The one I want to take a look at specifically is this one, because it has this little emissive section. If we take a look at this in the material editor, or material instance editor, we can see that it's actually using the same master material, but it has this glowing section. So how is that actually happening? Let's open up the master material, and I should have kept this open. We have an emissive section here, with emissive on and off. And as you can see, it's taking the same material, same texture, which is our masking texture, taking out the alpha, and pushing that through to be emissive. So yeah, it's basically a mixture of using these material functions, lerping them between each other in a way that makes sense, and applying using material instances to apply different base textures to lerp between these materials. And it all makes sense, and it's all pretty cool and useful, and pretty powerful. One of the best things I've found about this system is that if you want to make a change to everything to do with a master material, the example that I did for one of the maps I'm working on at the moment is DM Vacant. I actually copied the master material for the Liandry master material, because what I wanted to do was make it so that I could add vertex painting to add extra scratches and extra wear on the surface, as well as adding extra, being able to change the colour of the metal underneath and make it more like rust rather than fresh scratched metal. So if I quickly find, where was the master material for the default master material? As you can see, if I just look at the Liandry folder, there are several master materials that they actually use depending on exactly what they need to do. They have got the base Liandry one, they have an emissive one, you have a masked one. It's the same concept taken through, but slightly different setup. Whenever you want to basically change essentially the core of that texture, you make a different master material. So yeah, if you look at the differences between this setup and the setup I modified, the big one is down here in the Metal 01. I actually created a Did I actually use that? Or did I not? I did create a, yes, scratch multiplier vertex paint function. This is a function I made, which essentially takes in our base texture, our scratch texture, which is in the green channel. It uses a 3-point levels with a couple of exponents, and then lerps that with the vertex paint. So we're looking at taking the base, this texture, looking at that unmodified, and then modifying it where the vertex painted is, putting that through a 3-point level, lerping it with that vertex paint, multiply adding that, masking it, and then pushing it back out, which allows us, if I view it in cylindrical view, which this is a very strange little note I'll add to this video because it's kind of cool. If you use the box preview or the sphere preview in the material editor, it doesn't show vertex painting, which it's fine, it makes sense. If you use the sphere, the cylinder even, not the sphere, if you use the cylinder, it does, in the middle, show where the vertex painting would be. And I don't understand why. I don't understand, if that's intentional. I don't know if that's intentional, but it is cool. There, you can see, if I look at the master material as a cylinder, it's a fairly even level of wear across the whole surface. Whereas in this one, there's a lot more wear in the middle, which is where the vertex painting would be. And that's a change I made. And that means that I can take any material, I can take any one of these meshes. You can see that it's got the material instance here of the Leandri Door A floor trim 01. If I go up into door trim, what was it? Door A trim 01 pillar. Oh, I don't think I actually have duplicated that one. Or maybe I have. Yeah, okay. And I'll just duplicate that one and default it. So this one has the default, this one on the left here has the default material on it. And this one has the one that I made modifications to. And I can vertex paint this as long as it doesn't crash the editor. Okay, well the editor crashed, but that happens from time to time. So anyway, yes, as I was saying, I've got two pillars here. One of them has the default Leandri material here. The one that was set up before. This is the one that was by default on this mesh, and then I have the one that is modified by me to have the vertex painting on. As you can see, if I vertex paint this, doesn't really do anything at all. There's no effect. If I vertex paint this one, yeah, this is on the green channel by the way, it goes all worn and crazy. I can also, if I change the red channel, this is something I didn't mention in the last bit of the video, but I could change the material underneath to go all sort of rusted metal rather than bright shiny metal. And yeah, the reason this works and the reason I can do this all over the map rather than just in specific places is with master materials, because I made a change to the master material, and every other material throughout the level that uses that now has this functionality built in. So yeah, that's a rundown of master materials. I might not have covered everything. I might not have been clear on a few things. It's been a while since I've recorded anything. So yeah, if you have any questions, do feel free to ask. Anyway, you can find me on the UT forums, on IRC, and in this video. Yeah, I hope that was useful, and thanks for watching. Goodbye.